statecraft, but we were early in the stage of figuring out how this melded with theory and diplomacy, deterrence and war fighting, and it took us a good amount of time to work out how these things all fit together. Today, with cyber technology, the United States is coming to grips with a situation where it has a new tool that can do some impressive things. And it's also been the target of a number of cyber operations that are getting increasing attention within government and in the media. And the mood right now in Washington is to fight back. It's not to rely on deterrence and defense solely, but to defend forward, as some people have termed it. U.S. Cyber Command is now operating under a new doctrine called persistent engagement, which is designed not simply to deter cyber adversaries and defend against their operations and impose unacceptable costs on them, but also to take the fight to them, to disrupt, to go into their systems and force them to play defense, and in so doing complicate the cyber playing field and make it more difficult for them to engage in offensive operations against us. One of the differences between the 1950s with nuclear weapons and today is we're working out the theory part of this, the relationship to statecraft, in practice every day. These weapons are not sitting on the shelf while we think about the theory behind them. They're actually being employed by us and by our adversaries. And what I've asked our two guests today to address is how we should be thinking about this. What questions should we be asking about persistent engagement, about playing defense, about what deters, if anything, in the cyber domain, and what the risks are, as well as the opportunities that are associated with this new technology, which I think we all agree is going to be playing an incredibly important role in statecraft in the 21st century. To my left, Jason Healey is, I think, one of the most informed and most expert people in this cyber world. He's author of a book on the history of cyber conflict, A Fierce Domain. He understands both the technologies and the statecraft side of things, and has a long record of achievement in the academic world, in the think tank world, and in government. So I'm very pleased to have Jay here. I've been trying to get him down here to the center for quite some time, and when I learned that we had an opportunity this week, I seized it immediately. To my right is Ben Buchanan. Ben is at Georgetown University, and Ben has written a book which I find to be one of the best written, most understandable, and most insightful works on the relationship between international relations theory and the cyber domain. It's called The Cybersecurity Dilemma, and I'm very happy to have Ben here with us today. So, without further ado, let me turn it to Jay and hear your thoughts on this difficult subject.
Great, thank you very much for having me here at the center. Very much appreciate it, George. So I'll try and give, persistent engagement, this new strategy, it's not just a strategy, it's also a theory. It's a theory about cause and effect of they're doing X to us. If we do this, it is going to lead to these changes. So I find it's the biggest change in U.S. strategy in easily 20 years, since we first in the late 90s started to come up with the ideas of information warfare, information operations, and cyber conflict. But it's been really difficult to understand exactly what the Department of Defense, what the U.S. senior leadership what the academics who are behind these theories have actually meant. So it's nice to say, well, we want to do persistent engagement and forward defense, defend forward. What did that actually mean in the networks? How do they actually argue that that is going to make things better, not just in the short term, but over the very, very long term, not just over months, but over years and decades, because we are surely only at the very beginning of the age of operating in cyber. So I'm going to leave off all of my analysis of what's good about this or what's bad about it. I'll start with some of the history and how we got here over the past 20 years of leading up to this. And then I'll walk you through, here's the argument that the persistent engagers are making. And then I'll hand it off to Ben. For that second part, for the argument they're making, I've done a handout with my colleague Bob Jervis, who are doing the research, and we'll be talking about this box that's on the back page. So George has already introduced this quite a bit of what's involved in this. The leadership, like the General of U.S. Cyber Command, Paul Nakasone, he's been saying, we need to defend forward, limit the terrain over which the adversary can influence or control. We have to take the fight to the enemy just as we do in other aspects of conflict, operating against our enemies in their virtual territory, because the military cannot be successful if limited to DoD networks. You see, first I want to point out there's quite a gap in this. The Department of Defense is treating this as a very defensive strategy. They say this is not aggressive. We are looking to counter moves, and we will counter their moves in particular ways. That's very different from what you see from pretty much every other four-star general from the White House and from others. General Milley, when he was during his testimony for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, summarized it as, well, the best defense is a good offense. Cyber Command does not put it in that language. John Bolton would put it and disagree and say, yes, we're going to be offensive. Yes, we're going to be aggressive. So you did see the significant mismatch between the senior leadership and what the operational commander, U.S. Cyber Command. So, of course, you can imagine how we got very confused by this. So the history of how we got here lies in active defense and cyber deterrence. So I was setting up I was the Air Force Action Officer in 1998, and we were setting up the first Joint Cyber Command. And the charter came through and said, we want to do active defense in 1998. And we said, Air Force, critical non-concur, we said, you can't say that unless you define what that term means. And for the last 20 years, we haven't known what that means. Basically, it means the military, like almost any military, but certainly very much in the U.S. military mindset, if you know an attack is surely coming, you don't wait in your garrison for it to come. You are out there, you want to seize the initiative and put the adversary on the back foot, and if that means that means you need to operate outside of Department of Defense networks. This has been going on, like I said, since the 90s, of the DoD pushing for this, if there were being ideas for this, about wanting to take the fight to the enemy. There have been limitations. There's been confusion, especially over, is that covert action, is that traditional military activity, is that intelligence, how does this work with intelligence? Much of that has been clarified, including in the last National Defense Authorization Act, which did in fact say this isn't covert action, this is more like traditional military activity. There were also limitations from the White House. During, especially the Obama administration, there was a policy directive called PPD 20 that said, this is really risky stuff, and anytime you want to be doing X, I'll get to what X means, you probably are going to need to come back and check with us. It had relatively high bars for what the military or the intelligence communities might be able to do, especially if it would have a disruptive effect or impact allies. That's now been overturned under a new document called NSPM 13, which Bolton sold as, our hands are no longer tied as they were in the previous administrations. It said, if you're in the U.S. government and you've got authorities, go ahead and use them, and you don't have to come back to us for authority, or or for additional approval. And so now it looks like that really fills up this active defense. And that's where most of what the framing of the Department of Defense and U.S. Cyber Command. It also, you see this language of cyber deterrence. Again, one of these ideas that goes back to the 90s. It seems a very comfortable idea of saying, well, wait a minute, deterrence, that won the Cold War, right? So let's use it here. If adversaries are attacking us, then surely they're not scared of us. If their attacks are having impact on us, surely we're not resilient enough. And so there's a lot of language in deterrence that applies here. Cyber Command almost never uses that language. Only very rarely do they put this in the scope. Again, everything above their pay grade, General Milley, senators and members of Congress, the White House squarely put the new strategy in terms of deterrence. And so now you've got this strategy that's trying to put these together. So to go to the back page of the handout, and if you don't have enough, I've got some additional copies. Let me grab it real quick. So we're on the text on the back page. The argument that the persistent engagers made. So this strategy started with international relations theorists, like Fisher-Keller, Richard Harknett, Emily Goldman, and then got picked up from the international relations press. All three of them had associations with U.S. Cyber Command. So it really was this quite unique and amazing U.S. strategy that started in academia and then immediately got picked up by the operational command and is now national policy. It's hard to think of other examples. So it starts with point one, with the U.S. saying, well, adversaries are conducting attacks to destabilize us and degrade our national sources of power. It ends on step 10, which is the goal that we want in pursuing this strategy. And the goal is both stability and superiority. The documents are quite clear that we want strategic stability. I think it's implied we want a stable cyberspace, so strategic stability vis-a-vis our adversaries. I think it's kind of implied that we also want a stable cyberspace, but we also want superiority. That is, the ability to use cyberspace for our own national security purposes at times and places of our own choosing. That doesn't necessarily mean overall superiority, but certainly when we want to use it, we want to make sure that we can dominate. So steps 2 through 9 are how we're going to get there. And where I can, I've rooted all of these specifically in comments from General Nakasone, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and to a lesser degree in the documents of the theorists that did it. So, because adversaries are doing these free-for-all attacks, we have to defend forward as close as possible to the adversaries. They call it persistent presence. One of our colleagues, Josh Rovner, puts it in sports terms and say, in the past we used to think of this as American football, where you're sitting back and you're waiting for the play to happen, and then you rush at each other, and then you bang it out for a bit, and then there's a pause. He says, no, it's more like soccer. There is no operational pause. The sides are always in this contact with one another, and we have to get used to that, and therefore we need to be about persistent presence. The argument is, therefore, you need reduced operational constraints. In football, you can wait for the play to get called in from the coordinator. You can't in soccer. You've got to be out there, and you've got to let the players play the game and not try and oversee them. So with that operational constraint, we're going to intercept and halt cyber threats. We're going to degrade their infrastructure. So if we're seeing the Russians build a botnet, a set of linked computers to do malicious attacks against us or our allies, let's get in there and disrupt that. Let's change the password and let's lock them out of their own infrastructure. By getting in there, we can also see what they're doing, and that'll give us intelligence. So if we see there's going to be an attack, we can tell the U.S. organization or the allies that will be affected. If we see that they've got some new cool piece of malicious software, well, now we know about it and we can defeat it. That's step 5. Together, those things the U.S. The Cyber Command says are going to cause friction. That they're going to be having to defend their own systems. We take down their infrastructure. They're going to have to rebuild it. We learn about their malicious software. They have to develop more malicious software. That's going to impose this friction, and they're going to be spending more time on defense and have fewer resources to come at us. That will impose cumulative costs and affect their ability to come at us. There's an additional argument of how this will help, and this is step 8, of tacit bargaining. And you see this more on the academic side than you see the uniformed military talk about this. It's an argument rooted in Thomas Schelling, the academic theorist of the Cold War, of saying we're never going to come to agreement with the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, North Koreans at the negotiating tables at Geneva. The only way that the way that we're going to figure out what's acceptable or not is just getting in the pit and fighting it out. And if they come at us too hard on one thing, for example, we start seeing them get involved in messing with the elections for 2020, they're going to see just how hard we fight back. And we would do things that we wouldn't if they were merely doing geopolitical intelligence against a military command, which we accept as normal. Some people I've heard from the Pentagon say, and it's okay that it's preferable that they do that to us as well. Where we are going too far and crossing and getting close to their red lines, we need to encourage them to fight back tooth and nail against us, but only in those circumstances. And through this process of repeated interactions, we are going to learn about each other's left and right bookends. We'll figure out where the guardrails are by fighting it out. On the cyber, in the theory and in the operational commanders for Cyber Command is step 9. This is where deterrence comes in, according to the theory. Little of what came beforehand was actually about deterrence, or done for the purpose of deterrence. Step 9 is we're going to get into, say, the Russians' electrical grid, and there's been reporting by the New York Times and others, so that they're in our grid, and that way the president can hold them at symmetrical threat. You want to take down our grid, well, we can take down yours as well. And that's more pure deterrence that we kind of think about in Cold War terms. That's not what when Bolton talks about that, or General Milley or others, they will call all of this deterrence, but the theorists and Cyber Command are a little bit tighter on that. Hopefully all of those together are going to deliver those goals. So that's what we're talking about on persistent engagement. I'll give 2 examples, and I'll hand it over to Ben for his wisdom about what that actually means. So let's say U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency see some Russian military intelligence, GRU, cyber operators, that have infected computers in Turkey. And we suspect this is going to come at us, at our allies at some point. And they go from those computers in Turkey, and they go to computers in South Korea, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. In the old days, we might have needed White House approval to go and follow them into those new computers. We might have had to bring in the State Department and say, hey, by the way, let's go to the Dutch and tell them that they have these Russians on these computers, and we'll watch them together. What they're arguing for now, and the part that Cyber Command particularly emphasizes, is we don't need to do that anymore. State Department, and we certainly don't need to tell the State Department, we definitely don't need to tell the Dutch, or to get their approval, I should say. If we see the Russians go from the server in Turkey to the Netherlands, that Cyber Command needs the agility to follow those Russians onto that Dutch system. And at some point, if we need to dismantle what the Russians are up to, and they're on a Dutch system, again, we don't need to tell the Dutch or get their approval. We can just take them down from that. We can just take them down from that system. And the Dutch need to be happy, ought to be happy with us for that, because we didn't cause the problem, the Russians caused the problem, and we're simply liberating that system from the Russians. I think I'll leave it with that, and I'm really interested in hearing what Ben has to say.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, George, for putting this together, and always good to be on a panel with Jay, who's done probably more writing about system engagement than I think just about anyone else at this point. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack here and provide some context that I think is really important, especially for those who haven't studied cyber operations before. So my goal here is to unpack what you might call the operational realities of operating in offense and on defense in cyberspace. And I'm going to tell 3 stories, 2 about cyber operations and 1 from history, not about cyber operations. Let's start with offense. Many of you may have heard the story of Stuxnet, potentially the most significant cyber attack in history. I will tell this story in the case of Stuxnet, but what I say here, I argue, is a feature of offense in the cyber domain. So it is true of the 2 blackouts we saw in Ukraine. It is true of the Russian attack called NotPetya that did more than $10 billion of damage around the world. It is true of almost every offensive operation we've seen thus far. And the key story here is that you will hear in Washington, D.C. this notion that cyber war, whatever that is, takes place at the speed of light. And that's because so often the analysis of cyber operations, offensive cyber operations, begins at the end, when the operation has unfolded, and ignores all the steps that come before that enable that operation. And you might say, well, we have parallels to this in conventional operations, right? We understand when the president fires cruise missiles into Syria that, at least intellectually, there was a lot of preparation required to develop the cruise missile, to build the cruise missile, to do some reconnaissance, and then to give coordinates and fire the cruise missile. What's important in cyber operations is that the reconnaissance and preparation are different. The reconnaissance and preparation is particular to the target, and it happens in the target's network. Unlike building a cruise missile in the United States, the cyber weapon in many respects is dependent on information gathered from the target network. So in the case of Stuxnet, it was preceded by months, if not years, of reconnaissance into the Iranian systems. There was a piece of malicious code that almost no one ever discusses called Fanny, and this did extensive reconnaissance of Natanz, the Iranian nuclear facility. It mapped out the contractor networks that would be used to deliver the malicious code, or at least one version of the malicious code. It mapped out the Iranian nuclear program, how the centrifuges were configured, how they spun, how they worked, and ultimately how they would break. And it's reported that the United States and Israel built replica facilities of the Iranian nuclear site to test this malicious code to make sure that it would work. One technical analysis of the Stuxnet code said that it showed such detailed understanding, such detailed reconnaissance of the target systems that they probably knew the preferred pizza toppings of every employee in the facility. I'm not sure the Iranians are big on pizza, but I defer to the gathered intelligence on that one. And what's striking here is that this dynamic plays out again and again. Again, it happens in Stuxnet, with Fanny that precedes it, the 2 blackouts in Ukraine, one in 2015, one in 2016, both caused by Russia, both preceded by months of reconnaissance. In the first case, gathering employee credentials, traversing the network. In the second case, developing custom malicious code to figure out how the power system would work and how the power system could go down. So I posit, as a first move here, that this is an operational feature of cyber offense that is different from the other kinds of offense that we play, where we can build a Tomahawk cruise missile in our territory and retarget it, sometimes in the air, pretty easily. If you want to have an offensive cyber capability against an adversary nation or potential adversary nation, you need to break into that nation's networks in advance of conflict, or in advance of a crisis, in order to get the information you need to develop the capability. And for many nations, this is an imperative to action. This is cause for them to develop capabilities against other nations, because if they wait until a crisis, it's too late. And it's better to have the capabilities and not need them than to need them and not have them. So that's offense. Let's talk about defense. We talk a lot about persistent engagement. We talk a lot about the change in strategy. I very much agree with Jay that there has been a change in strategy here. We have been doing active defense, as Jay said, for a long time. One of the stories that I wrote about in my book was a previously secret operation. I didn't leak it. Snowden did. In which the United States had been suffering a series of Chinese intrusions into the Department of Defense for a sustained period of time, more than a decade. And the defensive parts of the NSA went to the offensive parts of the NSA and said, look, can you help? And the offensive parts said yes, and they carried out an operation in which they essentially hacked the computers from which the Chinese were hacking, and then hacked upstream into the Chinese network, and then hacked the internet service provider that was maintaining all of the computers for the Chinese military in that part of the country, and used this to gain a very detailed understanding of how the Chinese were operating, who was on the team, and where they were going next. For good measure, they then went and hacked the home computers of the Chinese hackers as well. So they were pulling back all this information on who the Chinese hackers were, how they were operating. The next time the Chinese went to act, they were ready to step in and block the attack. Now, this is a high watermark, I think, for defensive success. It's certainly the case that there have been many cases in which, despite the best efforts, this was not nearly as successful. But the point here is that this case was probably 2010 or 2011, at this point almost a decade ago, and this was pretty much standard operating procedure then. From that baseline, we've escalated further, it seems, with persistent engagement. And saying, not only will we hack you for defensive purposes to interfere, to understand your operations, we can block on our end, we will hack you to interfere. And a lot of the talk of persistent engagements about we're going to put sand in your gears, we're going to find ways to disrupt your operations in your network, rather than just gathering intelligence that we will use for our network. And the third story that I want to tell picks up on this notion of intelligence and how intelligence relates to escalation between nations. And in my discipline and Jay's discipline of political science, I think we're quite bad at understanding this link. A lot of times we focus only on military operations and their potential for escalation. And certainly there's concern about that with persistent engagement. But more generally, we often misunderstand the degree to which even intelligence collection that's intrusive can lead to escalation and lead to an adversary nation feeling a threat from the United States. So the story is from the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 28, 1962, and as the battle of wits is happening between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the United States is, in many respects, continuing business as usual in its military. And one of the things the United States did during that period of time was it conducted air sampling missions over the North Pole. It would fly up a spy plane, and it would sample the air to make sure the Soviets were not conducting atmospheric nuclear tests. Perfectly routine. On this day, October 28, 1962, the United States gets particularly unlucky. The Northern Lights are very strong that day. The U-2 spy plane makes a wrong turn, as it were, and it flies into the Soviet Union. Now, the plane is unarmed. The Soviets don't know this. They see this big lumbering spy plane coming in, sort of over their northern flank at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they scramble up fighters to intercept it. The U-2 spy plane radios back to the nearest American air base in Alaska and says, I'm in serious trouble here, send whatever you've got. The only thing the United States has ready to go are two fighters armed with air-to-air nuclear weapons. So they send them. No one's told the White House, no one's told McNamara. At some point, you don't want to be the highest-ranking person in the military who knows of a nuclear crisis. So you hustle and tell the White House. And the military aide bursts into the Oval Office, and Kennedy and McNamara are meeting. And Kennedy says, the aide said, this is what's happening, and McNamara says, this means war with the Soviet Union. What he didn't say, and what he could have said, is this is a war we've been doing everything in our power to try to prevent with the showdown over Cuba. And now it's going to happen because of an intelligence collection mission that we didn't really need right now, a wrong turn, and the Northern Lights. But the Soviets, from their perspective, saw this as an intrusion. And this was a theme throughout the Cold War again and again, of intelligence operations conducted by the United States against the Soviets, conducted by the Soviets against the United States, that were designed genuinely to gather defensive information, animating fear on the other side. The United States had a policy for a long time of faking air attacks on the Soviet Union. It would run the bombers right at the border and pull them out at the last second, getting the Soviet air defenses to light up. Happened in 1983 as well with naval attacks. The question that this raises, in my view, is what is the relationship between intelligence and escalation, or between activities that we do with genuinely defensive intent and escalation that we don't want? And international relations theorists have thought about this for a long time in a military context. We have the notion of the security dilemma, It goes back in one form or another to the ancient Greeks. Thucydides, the great historian, wrote that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that inspired in Sparta that made the Peloponnesian War inevitable. That's the big 30,000-foot strategic security dilemma. What's interesting to me is what's the 5,000-foot security dilemma, where you're talking about actual operations governed by the operational realities of cyberspace, the need to develop capabilities in advance for offense if you don't intend to use them, the advantages you get from spying for defensive purposes, and now this new territory of interfering with adversary operations in their networks, not just in collecting intelligence, but actually manipulating and thwarting them before they can even get started. My view is that this may be the right strategy. I'm certainly nowhere near well informed enough because it draws on classified information to question the strategy in any kind of detail, but we have to be mindful of history and we have to be mindful of operational reality when we evaluate a strategic change like this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you both. We're going to open the session up for questions from you all now. Ground rules for questions: please state your name and institutional affiliation, and please keep it in the form of questions if you can, as opposed to lectures. So I think we have the first one here, Ambassador Burt.
Yeah, this was excellent presentation by both of the panelists. So congratulations. And I guess the aspect of this set of issues that is most interesting to me is the resemblance or non-resemblance between deterrence and defense in the cybersphere versus the nuclear sphere. In fact, George, you began by talking about the early days of the development of nuclear strategy. But what happened, of course, in the United States as American nuclear strategy developed into the 1960s, but then finally in the 70s, is finally somebody started to recognize that, gee, what we think is a deterrent strategy, what we think, and McNamara played around in the early 60s with a denial strategy, a no-city strategy, but finally ended up with mutual assured destruction and so on, may not be deterring the Soviets. And they may have an entirely different concept of deterrence. In fact, once people started to look at that, they found that the Soviets did have a different approach to deterrence. It was developed by a different mindset. And even today, you could argue that there are important distinctions between how the Russians and the Chinese, by the way, think about nuclear weapons in the case of compared to the United States. But my question for the panelists is, how much thinking has been done when you think about a strategy like persistent engagement, and you look at countries like Russia, China, Iran, and others? Has anybody done any thinking about how they derive their strategies and how differing strategies would interact with an American approach? Or is the assumption, once again, that there's only one way to think about this?
Great. Thanks. That's absolutely right. There's been a lot of thinking in the extending what's appropriate or not appropriate from the nuclear deterrence world. The biggest change, I think there's two points I want to come at. One is there's a sense of, it's a very American perspective in what we're doing, of saying, again, the point number one that I bring up on the back, of no one else is paying attention to norms or restraint except the United States. Is a very, very, very strong feeling that I get. And I wonder if my colleagues have been watching the same movie that I have. Like, I look back at the last 20 years and said, that's what you took from that? Where we were dancing in our intelligence superiority. This was the golden age of espionage. We've had extensive cyber covert actions. After the Snowden revelations, we told our European allies to stop whining. This is just how intelligence works. And then when China does the OPM hack, we say this is intolerable espionage and you've crossed a line. So on one hand, I think we have this deep lack of perspective on our side of what's been motivating our adversaries Adversaries will react very differently in deterrence if they're sure they're hitting back, not hitting first. And our adversaries are sure that or are pretty certain that they're hitting back. In the case of Iran, it's certainly true, or almost certainly true. And so, one, I find that a very dangerous difference in perceptions. Second is we do understand what has made China and Russia especially angry in the way they see this. They have been much more concerned about the cross-border flow of information, and see that we have been the ones that are breaking the norms and want to undermine their regimes and change the nature of the game. That by everything from Putin was sure the Panama Papers was a U.S. covert action directed at him, down to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, CNN, and that we've had this 20-year game since Clinton of fanning the flames of information across borders to bring them down. And we kind of have, right? Just like we knew the Soviet Union came down in part because of photocopiers and tapes, and we've been very clear that the internet, that autocracy will not stand in the face of the internet. We were really sure about that in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so I don't think we have done a good job of saying, right, well, what's this comparison between the cyber that this strategy is based in and the information that is driving the concerns of our adversaries? And we don't have to accept that those are valid concerns in blocking free flow of information, because that's built into our values and our Constitution, but it does help in understanding the dynamics in the back and forth.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a very important question. I would only make 2 points. The first is that deterrence is not monolithic, as your question suggests. And I think, especially those of us in political science, but also practitioners, can be too wedded to a notion of nuclear deterrence because it was the most significant kind of deterrence. It's no exaggeration to say the modern field of security studies, I think, owes its existence to this development, as George said at the outset, of nuclear deterrence. The reason we talk about bargaining and signaling and deterrence is because post-1945, suddenly the weapons became so terrible we couldn't actually use them. So the art of international affairs became, how do you operate short of all-out war? And that's where deterrence comes in. But nuclear deterrence is one particular kind of deterrence. In technical terms, we say it's specific. It's targeted at just one adversary, in the case of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and it's absolute. We tolerate no breach of the nuclear norm, and any breach of a nuclear norm is met with massive punishment. That is not the only model of deterrence. If you think about how we deter crime, for example, that's the polar opposite. We call it general deterrence. We are trying to deter crime across the population. We don't know who the actor will be. And we call it restrictive. We know we cannot deter all crime, but we want to deter as much of it as we can. It seems to me, when we talk about cyber operations, we probably need more humility in our deterrence. And it's closer to deterring crime for almost every operation, except for the very top of the threshold, than is deterring nuclear weapons. And that requires acknowledging up front that it's not always going to be successful. And I think my view is that I'm more skeptical of the notion of cyber deterrence for all but the most dangerous operations than many people.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative here as the moderator and ask a question of the panelists myself. We all like to think in categories as humans. It's natural inclination. And the categories we're thinking about today include things like offense and defense, deterrence versus operational activity, intelligence and war, military operations and intelligence. And the question I have for you is, are those categories even appropriate when talking about the cyber domain? Are the distinctions between offensive and defensive activities as clear in this domain as they are in bricks and mortar terms from the past? Is the difference between war and military operations and intelligence as clearly delineated in this domain as before? In other words, do we have to think about this in different categories than what we're accustomed to.
Well, these are my favorite chapters of Ben's book, so I'll let Ben.
Yeah, I think you can guess where I come down on this one, given the stories I told at the outset, and the answer is no. I think that we talk ourselves into a theoretical box that does not match the real world when we try to draw bright lines in the world of cyber operations. There are lines you can draw. There is purely defensive activity, setting up firewalls and antivirus in your network. The challenge is that for modern nations, that is not seen as nearly sufficient. So nations, particularly the United States, China, Russia, get themselves into the mindset, probably not without justification, that they need to penetrate each other's networks for both offensive purposes and defensive purposes. It is exceptionally hard if you're on the receiving end of an intrusion to figure out the intention of that intrusion. So there's a muddy line between offense and defense there, at least in its perception, if not in its reality. International relations theorists have known for a long time that you have poor differentiation between offensive activity and defensive activity. That is not a great sign for stability. That leads to unintentional escalation and misinterpretation. Certainly, I think there's a lot of blurriness between war and peace. I don't think these are useful concepts in cyber operations. There's strong support historically that these are not as useful in regular operations as we might think. Kennan, of course, has written about the quiet struggle between nations, this rhythm of struggle that constantly occurs both in and out of war. I think nowhere is that more true than cyber operations.
And I would definitely agree on cyber operations and cyber conflict, not on cyber security. You know, after I left the Air Force, I set up the first computer response operations at Goldman Sachs, and it was really clear what defense was, right, and what we were allowed to do and what wasn't. When you're taking that away from just cybersecurity and you're looking at conflict and the more national security, it's true. And I'd like to link this with the deterrence question beforehand. And a deterrence starts as an academic theory of cause and effect. That if we've got, I'll use one aspect of it, we'll simplify that if we've got capability and the adversary thinks we're going to use it, that it's going to lead to restraint, stability, and ultimately peace. Ben brought up another theory, a competing theory of security dilemma. And there the theory is, well, if you're building strength, your adversary doesn't know how you intend to use it, and that they have to build strength, and that can ultimately be destabilizing. So my colleague that I'm doing this work with, Bob Jervis, wrote in 1978, Operation on the Security Dilemma, that a security dilemma, as Ben described, is doubly dangerous if you can't distinguish offense from defense, and the offense has the advantage. Because if you can't distinguish offense and defense, then if Ben is building capability, it might not just be to protect himself, he may be aiming it at me. And if I can't distinguish offense from defense, then I better hit him first, and he better hit me first, because the advantage in going first is so strong. Those are both things that we talk about cyber conflict. Offense advantage, and can't distinguish offense from defense. But as George was leading into, you can't just distinguish offense and defense easily. You can't distinguish offense, defense, espionage, offensive prep of the environment, reconnaissance before an attack to figure out, get your targeting done. It's not just two adversaries, it's multiple adversaries. It's very low barriers to entry in general. And you're not just stockpiling the capability, in the classic security dilemma, but we're actually using the capabilities all of the time against each other in covert and deniable ways. So I end up saying, boy, this might be incredibly escalatory if this argument of security dilemma is accurate.
Paul Bremer.
I have a follow-up to Rick's question. And if you look at item 8 on your list here about tacit bargaining eventually happens, it raises the question of signaling. Now, in the various nuclear fields that Rick was talking about, there was important signaling that was available. But I don't see any intentional signaling built into your process here. So how do we deal with that in this area?
Right, and And to be clear, in this 1 through 10 is the argument from Cyber Command and those that are supporting it. I'm just trying to pull apart how they see cause and effect. Absolutely right. Joe Nye zoomed in on exactly the same point. There's no theory of communication. The main way of signaling is the conflict itself. In Cold War and other areas, the ambassador said, well, we had DEFCON 3, right? You could put bombers on alert. You had back channels, you had hotlines. We have almost none of that. We do have a few hotlines, but they tend to be at the level of between presidents. We're still, by law, the military, we can't do mill-mill cooperation or discussions with the Russians in most cases. So you're right, we have very little of that. Also, I'm worried about the interagency, is that if we say we want to bring down the tone of things, and maybe DOD will do that, but Department of Justice might bring indictments that just inflame.
But the military has systems for deconfliction, as they call it. Rather inelegant term.
With adversaries?
Yeah.
Yeah, very little of that happens here.
We used in Syria with the Russians for.
But that's a fairly narrow channel focused on Syria and
But
those
my
forces.
point is, it should be built into
I agree.
to the military part of this. It's not just for diplomats.
Exactly so. And right now, to a significant degree, it's prevented by law. Even in Syria, they had to call it deconfliction rather than cooperation or any other term. Be very difficult here. The Chinese have refused to do that with us for the most part, since we indicted some PLA officers. So we might be signaling, we think we're signaling one thing, but if we have indictments and we don't have a good interagency process right now to make sure that's going to happen smoothly.
I want to pick up on this, is really important. So this is the subject of the book that I'm finishing right now, and maybe as my want, I'm a pessimist on this. And the reason why is I am very skeptical that cyber operations are useful for signaling for a couple different components. The first is the operational nuances of this domain are not understood by policymakers. The ambassador mentioned DEFCON 3, Jay mentioned bombers on alert. In the Cold War, senior military experts, and indeed sometimes the president, understood what that meant. The similar equivalent steps of preparation and alert in cyber operations are not understood at high levels of government, in almost every case. Secondly, I actually think nations do try to signal in cyber operations. They're just not understood by the adversary. And indeed, sometimes the signals that are sent are very different than the signals that are received. One example of this are the 2 blackouts I mentioned in Ukraine. I think there's pretty solid evidence that the Russian hackers were not going all out in both those cases. They were showing some restraint. I have never, I mean never, heard the technical nuances of that restraint discussed in a U.S. policy context. It's very possible the Russians were sending a signal, especially with the 2016 blackout, which could have been deployed against American technology as well. Almost no discussion of what the signal was, if there was a signal. And third is that I just think cyber operations are better for shaping. If you look at signaling as a high-stakes game of poker where you're bluffing or trying to suggest your hand, I think it's better, the capability of the operations are better suited to just stealing the card or stacking the deck. And the book that I'm working on is to show in the last 20 years of how many operations were meant to directly shape the environment. And the adversary doesn't even know, by the time they know it's too late, versus to signal and suggest and threaten and coerce and hint. All the things that we've spent 7 decades in international relations theory talking about. I don't think that works here.
Jason.
Just a second, we'll have a microphone coming your way.
Jason, when you look at the aspiration of China and Russia in cyberspace, are their aspirations aligned with their capabilities?
I think so. I mean, if we say that Russia is driven because it lost the Cold War, our aspiration, we won the Cold War. There's no one that could tell us no. If we wanted to do something, we were the only ones that could be the peacekeepers, and if we were the only ones that could do things to keep the world stable and productive. Russia does what they did because they lost the Cold War. Lost it, feeling insecure, feeling like a regional power. we saw a significant change in their behavior after Crimea. Before that, they were really noted for high degrees of tradecraft and restraint, largely espionage and not disruption. After Crimea, that changed. They were a lot less cared about being caught. We knew it was them, they knew it was them, and they would, but whereas beforehand they might back off and then come back and do something else quiet, here they were just, no, yeah, that's right, it's us, let's go at it. Many more disruptive attacks. Because they've had relatively low levels of aspiration, I think, like just keep frozen conflict, keep things discombobulated, keep themselves in the mix, keep us worried about them and focused on them as an adversary, I think that's largely succeeded. They've been able to affect the elections and other things and have multiple ways they can do that. For China, if we say their aspirations, right, if we won the Cold War, Russians lost the Cold War, for China it was they've been behind. Since the unequal treaties of the 1840s and onwards, anything justifiable against the West to catch back up is justified. I think they've been more than effective at that in trying to keep us out of the inner island chains. It'll still be up in the air. I think they'll have some confidence about their ability to do that. Certainly I think we're quite worried about that. Would they have the ability to disrupt the U.S. flow of forces into theater by disrupting Transportation Command, disrupting the logistics companies? I think they have reasonable confidence that they could probably pull that off.
The only dimension I would add is it is very easy, necessary to some degree, but still too easy to treat Russia and China as monoliths. Each of these countries has a sprawling bureaucracy that conducts cyber operations just as we do. Each of these countries has competition between units of the bureaucracy, and you can get outcomes and outputs that seem inexplicable unless you understand the bureaucratic inflation that we don't often understand. I'm thinking in mind here the tension between the Russian FSB and the GRU, and their very different approaches to cyber operations.
And you have seen the Chinese, like if the change in Russian behaviors after Crimea, the change in Chinese behaviors, maybe 3 years back, where President Xi has just been consolidated.
Yep.
Whereas beforehand you saw this proliferation of groups. Now it's much more under central control, as completely befits the other areas where Xi is putting control.
That's right.
Thank you. Russ Deming at SICE. Is there any room here for track 2 discussions, or even track 1.5, between Americans such as yourselves and Russians and Chinese in the conceptual framework of cyber warfare, or is that just too sensitive, too much potential for misleading, just too hard to do?
The toughest thing about this business is getting down to ground truth. And in general, my concern with a lot of the discussions we have about things like norms, diplomatic relations, and track 2 dialogues is that we don't get down to ground truth of what actually is happening. And these are some of the most secret operations these governments conduct. And if they're secret but impactful, those are the things that are going to drive the strategic reality, not track 2 discussion. Which is not to say we shouldn't try, but we should be very realistic here about how much activity is secret. And I think if you're in Jay's shoes or my shoes, or you're someone who's thinking on this stuff, you need to spend a lot of your time figuring out what actually happens and seeing the world as it is.
There have been some CSIS, CSIS has had a track 1.5 for a while, which I participated in. I lived in Hong Kong for several years with Goldman Sachs, and that's been on and off again depending on the nature of the relationship. There's been good things that came from that. Major General John Davis, retired U.S. Army, he'd been the top DoD official in cyber. He's been talking with his colleague, retired 3PLA general, like their equivalent of NSA, and so you've got not just the 1.5, but you've got these back doors between the generals. Would a track 1.5 or track 2 work with the Russians? I just had some folks bring it up. East-West has some. I think it would be worthwhile to get to the earlier point of some kind of backdoor between the retired generals, so that we've got some way to do some signaling. Might I think on the Russian side really pay off.
Hold on here. Let's see. I've got Marvin Ott next on the list.
Argonaut, Wilson Center, and Johns Hopkins. This goes back to a comment Jay made a couple minutes ago about the advantage being with the offense. And the question is asked out of pure ignorance because it's a pure technology question. For the people that are deeply expert in the technologies, as they look ahead, do they see a baked-in, sort of irreducible advantage for the offense that will be there, because of the very nature of the technology? If the answer to that is yes, then I would be deeply pessimistic about the potential for avoiding, really serious conflict in this arena.
I don't want to speak for Jay, but I think if you go back to IR theory, it's actually not a question of ground truth on offense-defense advantage that matters. It's a question of perception. And when I wrote this chapter of the book about offense-defense perception, what I could find remarkably was how everyone agrees on all sides that offense has the advantage. I'm actually a little bit more skeptical. There are some cards that good defenders have to play. We haven't played them, but it's possible to get much better at defense than we are. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if an academic thinks that. It's what policymakers think. The World War I example shows that prior to World War I, everyone had this notion that offense had the advantage, and they wasted a lot of European lives figuring out the hard way that actually in machine gun trench warfare, defense has the advantage. My concern is we're going to repeat that. So even if defense has the advantage in cyber operations, as long as the perception remains that offense enjoys it, and that shows no signs of changing, I share your pessimism.
And there's some things coming down the line. I've got a fair amount on my other side of work that's trying to say, how can we change this? How can we give the defender the greatest the advantage over attackers? It's been like this for 4 decades. It goes back from the 1970s, talking about how the attacker is generally going to get through. And so I do worry about a tipping point where it's not just the attacker has advantage, they have supremacy. And there's some technologies coming down. Some of our colleagues will go on about AI, for example. I think AI is likely to aid the attacker more than the defender.
AI can play offense too.
Yeah, that's Ben's point, especially, or specialty. Cloud technologies. In Washington, D.C., the conversation says, well, cloud technologies are great, but in New York City, when I talk to the chief information security officers for banks and the rest, they say the cloud is great and we haven't even begun to see the full benefits. The internet was never built to be secure. With cloud technologies, you can build the entire foundation. You can architect it so that it's secure from all the way up. And so there's some things that are coming through that some of my more optimistic and rosy colleagues, there's not many of us in cybersecurity, but there are a few that think we might be turning this around. But I would say that's the minority opinion.
Okay. Paul Saunders.
I guess I'm kind of developing a new appreciation of ignorance is bliss. As I sit here and listen, I was very much focused, actually, like Jerry Bremer on point 8 and on actually Rick's question and the differences between nuclear and cyber. And this is, George and I have talked a lot about this in the past. And I guess the thing that really bothers me about all of this is, George talked about the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, and we were kind of iteratively, developing the signaling and the rules and everything for conducting the Cold War. But we did all of that while not using nuclear weapons. and it just seems to me like that's a really profound difference, actually, between that period and this period of developing the rules, which is we're actually using it every day in an environment which looks to me like actually, as somebody who just reads the media, it doesn't look to me like anybody has been successfully deterred yet, and maybe somebody has. Obviously, we wouldn't know. Deterrence is something that happens inside somebody else's head, right? But
present the persistent engagement argument here that
Actually,
says
that's what I wanted.
we
That's
shouldn't
what I
be as
wanted to-
concerned about escalation as we are.
That's what I wanted to add at the end, thank you.
So the argument from the persistent engagers is absolutely, you're right. In nuclear, we didn't use them here. We are using them. We have to recognize that and embrace that as this difference, and that through this repeated use, it gives us all sorts of interactions. We have tons of repeated interactions. One of our colleagues compares it and says this is an intelligence game, like we're always back, like espionage, what you might call it anti-submarine warfare, right, where you had both sides are competing quite vigorously in the space, the exciter flights, the canopy, like air defense in the Cold War. Well, that would be their argument of saying we have to embrace this, that it doesn't escalate into kinetic. Right, we've been throwing all sorts of cyber punches, but no one has responded with kinetic back yet in any significant way. The Israelis did against Hamas, but that's I think a relatively limited example. It only escalates within cyberspace. I think that would be their argument. I think Ben and I come down on the pessimistic on that, but I do want to pick up on your one. I think deterrence does it at least appears to work. Because we haven't gone out of cyber into kinetic, right? No cyber attacks have killed anyone that we can figure out yet. So some kind of restraint is happening. In other kinds of warfare, we would call that restraint deterrence, that no one's gone above that line, us or them, because we know there'd be consequences, right? I mean, we can call that deterrence close enough. Also, we do know of a very specific deterrence incident. General Clapper and Ben Rhodes both said that in the sit-room conversations, they took options off the table because General Clapper said, because the Russian presence in the grid.
This is summer 2016.
Yeah. And that we were afraid that we would do something, the Russians would do something, and they would end up, we knew they were in the grid and they might take the grid down. Ben Rhodes said, we were afraid the Russians would use their presence and actually change vote tallies and or directly affect the elections. So, and I was able to ask when he was up at Columbia, Director Clapper, and A, is that true? And B, do you agree that this was deterrence? And he said yes, it happened, and it absolutely was deterrence. So a lot of our colleagues are still treating this as theoretical, and it isn't theoretical anymore.
Thank you.
Covered it.
Okay, I think I've got Mike McGuff.
Yeah, thanks. This is a follow-up a bit to the talk about the discussions between private experts. President Trump got a big pushback early in the administration when he proposed a joint U.S.-Russian cybersecurity force. Seemed to have backed that up. Is there anything? Is such an animal ever possible? And beyond that, since we're talking about analogies with nuclear deterrence, could you ever have a cyber version of the IAEA or some international body that could actually keep track of compliance, assuming there were diplomatic agreements?
It will stun you to know that I'm pessimistic. A couple of reasons why. First, verification is always the challenge in this area. And obviously it took us several decades during the Cold War to work out arms control mechanisms and the like, but we got there on some areas. It's worth noting how intrusive the verification mechanisms were to secure those commitments. So look at the Open Skies Treaty, for example. You look at the fact that under a variety of Cold War treaties, nations were not allowed to encrypt the telemetry of their missiles. And then the other side could use the all-national means to intercept those unencrypted telemetries and use that to understand capabilities. This essentially was an understanding between nations that we would leave some of our capabilities out there. It would not jeopardize the capabilities, but it would help you as the adversary understand them. The problem with cyber operations is that, as a generalization, they're much easier to hide, right? It's much easier to hide some computer code than it is to hide a ballistic missile fleet. And revealing the capabilities often renders them much less potent in a way that revealing a nuclear weapon does nothing to undermine its potency. You can understand that it's coming, you can understand how it works, and it's still going to hit you. Not so with cyber capabilities. some structural reasons that make me very pessimistic about arms control in this space.
And I'll even broaden that. It's a great point. And to me, it applies to signaling and stability also, in that in the Cold War we accepted, even though it hurt us in nuclear warfighting, we accepted that the Soviets would have infrared satellites looking at our missile fields so that it would make them feel more secure. Jim Miller, the former Undersecretary for Policy at the Pentagon, says he loves that the Russians have mobile missiles because it's stabilizing even though Strategic Command hates it. We don't have that balance in cyber of, it's all about superiority, right? I mean, we're going to get stability because through superiority. If we were to, the Chinese haven't agreed to some of our proposals in small part because they know we're better at attribution than they are, and that we could catch them cheating, but they'd never be able to catch us cheat. And so it might be stabilizing if we help them be better at attribution and catching us. But that's almost, it's almost a laughable idea.
Just on the attribution point, Jay, it's worth noting, one of the surest ways to attribute a cyber attack on another nation is not just forensics on the receiving end, that we do that, but by hacking into their networks for the defensive purposes I described earlier and watching them do it. The New York Times reports this is how the United States knew that it was North Korea that hacked Sony. The evidence is pretty clear regardless, but...
on the joint cybersecurity forces, it's been interesting to watch NATO. I'm still with Atlantic Council as a senior fellow. It's been great to see what's been happening as Atlantic Council is tracking what NATO's been putting together over the years. On IAEA, extremely difficult. The closest thing right now is actually is going to be forming up now in Geneva, funded by Microsoft, MasterCard, the Hewlett Foundations, and others, to say not everyone is going to believe in national government like the U.S. doing attribution, and so you need an independent organization that's going to be doing this. It's called the Cyber Peace Institute. And that leads me to one of the, actually, let me hold it off there.
No, please.
One of the biggest, to me, the biggest difference in cyber conflict when I compare it to normal conflict, it's not the speed or the difficulty of attribution or any of the things that General Nakasone tends to bring out. It's the role of the private sector. Almost no large cyber conflict has ever been solved by any government ever. It's the private sector that brings, the Microsofts, big cybersecurity companies like FireEye and CrowdStrike that have speed, have agility, subject matter expertise, and they have their hands deep in cyberspace. One of the folks I served with went to Verizon, and he said, you know what, we can bend cyberspace if we need to. Cyber Command can't do that. The U.S. government doesn't have any buttons and levers that are actually connected to anything in that sense. What the government brings is massive resources, staying power, and access to other levers of power, from diplomacy to the bully pulpit to stabbing people in their sleep. That's tougher for Microsoft to do, and so we really need to bring that together. And sometimes, depending on the audience, I'll put that in terms of counterinsurgency. Great. The Department of Defense had to accept that in many circumstances, we have to work through the host government. And that the only way to achieve something. In cyberspace, the private sector is the home government. And we've got to be used to not trying to do everything ourselves, but to rely on them.
Thanks.
Question? Yeah.
Briefly, Gary Huffstar with the Peterson Institute. If President Trump decides to use cyber offensive capability to disable an Iranian refinery, what is your speculation on the Iranian response?
Iran has shown that it is not shy about using its own cyber capabilities, and they've built them quite well. So Iran has, in at least 3 major instances, targeted U.S. and allied entities. In 2012, they launched a quite devastating attack on Saudi Aramco, wiping 35,000 computers on a single morning. In 2014, they attacked Sands Casino after provocative comments made by Sheldon Adelson. And in 2012 as well, they attacked U.S. financial institutions. So my best guess is we would expect something of that ilk. How much they've advanced their capabilities in the last 5 to 7 years, we may find out.
I have one final question if there's nothing else from the audience. Okay, we have one in the back, Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm actually an intern here at the organization. My question actually pertains to something that was sort of noted before, which was NATO, and more so the idea of collective security. So NATO obviously has an Article 5 that says, hey, if we get attacked, militarily, but this doesn't necessarily apply to cyber attacks. So how do you see something like the cyberspace inherently affecting the concepts of collective security and what our allies might be able to do to help us in the future with things like this?
The PhD that has not been written has the title Cyber Operations and Alliances, because there's a lot of questions that flow from what you just asked, and I don't think we've worked through any of them. So we know there's a very strong alliance in cybersecurity, and that's the Five Eyes: the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the 5 largest English-speaking democracies. I think how cyber operations relate to NATO is a lot less clear, both in terms of collective defense, in terms of capability sharing, in terms of intelligence sharing. There's a lot, the devil's in the details there, and we have not worked a lot of that out. It's worth noting that NATO countries are targets of U.S. cyber espionage, and many of them are aggrieved about that.
And will be more so with persistent engagement, right? Whenever I'm stuck on these, I like to reverse the question and imagine that, because right now a lot of these questions are difficult because frankly most of these attacks we're talking about have been strategically inconsequential, right? For the most part. All right, great, a casino got taken down. I mean, that's not why we got into national security to worry about, the Iranians taking down a casino. So I always like to reverse the question and say, all right, imagine that NATO just declared an Article 5 because of a cyber attack. What just happened? Tell me about that cyber attack. It's a good essay question. I should give my students. Say it was Maria's idea. Right, it's not going to be because espionage. It's not because someone took down a casino, right? It's going to have to be something like the last time and the only time we declared Article 5, right? You've got a smoking hole in the ground. You've got 3,000 people dead. I mean, it was really, really significant event that just happened for NATO to be crossing that line. Right? So it's going to be based on the scope, duration, the intensity of the attack, to some degree who got attacked. Now, I have been pushing...
And who did it, how much we want to fight.
Right. Yeah, because you're seeing the Eastern neighbors, the Russia neighbors, the Eastern members of NATO have a very different view from the Western. I had a piece with Thomas Ilves, the former president of Estonia, that came out 2 years ago, that said, let's focus on Article 4, which is consultation. And I'm still bewildered and a little bit angry that we haven't done an Article 4 consultation on Russian election interference. It's a much lower bar. It's only a consultation. It's not a call to action. And you can do it for something that affects the political independence or territorial integrity of a state or something like that, clearly within scope. And so I'd be very interested in Article 4.
Did you have another one?
Yeah, can I ask one? I'm going to ask 2 questions. But I'm going to go back to this nuclear issue, but raise a different element of the cyber aspect, which is there is a former British Minister of Defense, Des Brown, who for the last 18 months or so has been arguing that he believes that this emerging or evolving cyber threat could in fact destabilize nuclear deterrence by giving governments, in theory, the capacity to attack the command, control, communications, and intelligence capabilities of, say, the United States, Russia, or China. In other words, that governments could actually lose control of their nuclear weapons. And in such a situation, he then goes on to argue that nuclear deterrence becomes suspect. It certainly is not credible any longer. And he then goes on to argue probably the end of nuclear deterrence brought about by the emergence of cyber warfare. What's your response to that pretty provocative argument?
I'm more skeptical of that between great powers because enough redundancy thus far, I think, in nuclear systems. This is a question no one's ever going to talk about for obvious reasons. It is worth noting that nuclear sabotage with cyber operations is not a hypothetical. I mentioned Stuxnet at the beginning. That is sabotaging a nuclear enrichment program. The New York Times reports that the United States sabotaged with some success North Korean's nuclear missile program or ballistic missile program. I think there are pretty significant, one could imagine significant concerns about that, if the United States demonstrates to other nations that it has the potential to sabotage means of nuclear delivery. What are the strategic effects of that? I don't know that if that was thought through, I don't know that we've made that public. We have not made that public.
I'd be very interested, not just in the cyber aspects of that, but also advances in AI detection that might be able to find our ballistic missile fleet, our submarine fleet, or that might be able to find the Russian mobile missiles. Right, either of those could be very destabilizing. Just now, I've got to read an article on Canopy Wing, which was the U.S. Cold War program for decapitation strikes that included the B-52s flying and then turn away last minute, but also had you might call it now a cyber component, right, or electronic warfare to disrupt command and control signals so the Russians couldn't get out, which was a minor aspect of what we had planned, but helped lead the Soviets to believe that we really were thinking about a surprise first decapitation strike, which I really want to read that for context on this, even more than I'm concerned about it for the U.S. and Russia or U.S. and China. Really, where India, what about India, Pakistan, and these less stable nuclear balances? And the last I'll say is I was on the Defense Science Board Task Force on Cyber Deterrence with Jim Miller, Jim Gosler, Nordy Schwartz, and others. And part of their answer to this was having a thin line of systems, of long-range strike systems, essentially B-52s, but we could imagine other systems that we knew were absolutely cyber secure. That right now we're in the process of taking the B-52s and making them digital, and that freaks a lot of us out, right? I was saying
analog.
Well, and that might be great for those that are going to be doing the traditional warfighting missions, right? I mean, that's great. But for the nuclear ones, let's keep one squadron, two squadrons back. Don't do that. Make sure that they've got very survivable systems so that no one feels they can do a cyber disarming strike on the nuclear command and control system. I don't know. I don't think that's gone anywhere. I don't know I think we would know about it if we had, because I think that would probably be a program of record.
Just one comment on this. I think this is one area where that blurring of intelligence reconnaissance on the one hand and warfighting preparation on the other becomes very important. A conflict or a crisis situation where an adversary, China, Russia, would have strong incentives to penetrate those nuclear command and control systems to find out what we're up to, right? That could easily be perceived as preparation for an attack that could jeopardize our second strike capability and create an enormous unintended incentive to use or lose on our part, and that's not how you would design crisis stability.
Can I take one point back on that? Because another point that ties to deterrence in Cold War on this, I just had a piece out on Lawfare where I tie this back to Wild Bill Hickok, who got shot in Deadwood because he was just bragging about what a killer he was. Hundreds of men he's killed. Probably wasn't true, but and so what happened? People didn't draw down on him on the street at high noon, right? He got shot in the back, and to me, that's what Wallster wrote about, right? If you and Wallster was writing in '64 that if we base our bombers really close to the Soviet Union to make it easier for us to refuel and do strikes, then that's going to be such a tempting target to the Soviet Union because they're there and they're vulnerable.
He actually made that argument in the 50s.
It was in the 50s. Wow. And so we're inviting a first strike by putting fragile offensive forces in a vulnerable position. I argue we're arguably doing the same with when I see the U.S. saying, look how strong cyber forces we have. Look how amazing our cyber forces we have, while knowing that we are incredibly bad on defense. So we're saying we've got this mighty right hook, but we know we have a glass jaw. So if the adversary thinks a conflict is going to happen anyhow, then their best bet is to hit us and hit our cyber forces beforehand. So we might be inviting that first strike. The weaker our defenses are, and the more that we brag about, because you see this a lot, we've got to make sure our adversaries know how good we are on offense. And it feels really good to talk about that. But yet it might do the opposite of what we want.
And I would add, we believe that that talk is deterring. That we will show our adversaries that they can expect a strong response, that we're not going to back down, we won't show weakness. And I think this is a good way to wrap this whole discussion up, because I think we've come full circle here to the risks that we might be facing in all of this and how we should be thinking about this. So thank you all for coming, and thank you.